At my 60th birthday party, my son-in-law Daniel stood up during the toast and handed me a check for $500. "Here, Margaret," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "For all those years of free babysitting, I think that's more than fair." The room went silent. I looked at the check, then at my daughter Claire's horrified face, then back at Daniel's smug smile. I folded the check once, twice, 3 times. Then I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out a brown envelope I'd been carrying for 6 months. "Thank you, Daniel," I said quietly, "but I think you'll want to read this first." I handed him the envelope. He opened it right there, in front of 43 guests in my small Vancouver apartment. I watched the color drain from his face as he read the first page, then the second. By the third page, his hands were shaking. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "I know everything, Daniel," I said. "Every single thing." He looked toward the door. Standing there, just arriving fashionably late as I'd asked him to, was James Corrigan, Claire's first husband. The man Daniel had told everyone was dead. Let me go back to the beginning. Not to 60 years ago when I was born in a small town outside Halifax, but to 6 years ago when Claire introduced me to Daniel at a Tim Hortons on Granville Street. She was 32 then, recently divorced from James, and Daniel seemed perfect. Attentive, successful, charming. He worked in real estate, he said. Dealt with high-end properties in West Vancouver. He wore expensive suits and drove a BMW. "Mum, he's nothing like James," Claire had said, gripping my hand across the table. "James was always so secretive, always working late. Daniel's an open book." I'd wanted to believe her. After the divorce, Claire had been so broken. She'd found out James had a gambling problem, debts she knew nothing about. The marriage had collapsed in 6 months. So when Daniel came along 8 months later, offering stability and warmth, I'd been relieved. Perhaps too relieved to ask the right questions. They married quickly. A small ceremony at Stanley Park, just family. Daniel's parents didn't come. "They're in Ontario," he'd explained. "Dad's not well enough to travel." Claire had been disappointed but understanding. That should have been my first warning. But I was too busy being grateful that my daughter was smiling again. The babysitting started when little Emma was born. My granddaughter, my first grandchild. I was 64 then, newly retired from teaching elementary school for 37 years. I had time. I had love to give. And Claire needed help. Daniel's real estate career was demanding, he said. Showings in the evenings, open houses on weekends. Claire had gone back to her nursing job at Vancouver General Hospital, working 12-hour shifts. "Mom, could you watch Emma on Tuesdays and Thursdays?" Claire had asked. "Just until she's old enough for daycare." "Of course, sweetheart," I'd said. "Bring her over any time." Tuesdays and Thursdays became Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Then it was 4 days a week, then 5. I didn't mind, not really. Emma was a delight. We'd go to the park, read stories, bake cookies. My small apartment in Kitsilano became her second home. I'd set up a corner with toys, bought a toddler bed for naps, stocked the cupboards with her favorite snacks. But Daniel never said thank you. Not once in 4 years. When he picked up Emma, he'd barely look at me. "She eat?" he'd ask. "She nap?" Then he'd bundle her up and leave. No acknowledgement of the 10-hour days I'd put in. No recognition that I'd canceled plans, missed book club meetings, turned down a trip to see my sister in Toronto. Claire noticed. "I'm sorry, Mum," she'd say quietly when Daniel wasn't around. "He's just stressed about work." But it wasn't stress. It was something else. Something that made my teacher's instinct, the one I'd honed over decades of spotting troubled children, prickle with unease. The real crack appeared a year ago. Emma was 4, starting junior kindergarten. I'd thought my babysitting duties would ease up. Instead, Daniel asked for more. "Claire's picking up extra shifts," he said. "We need the money. Real estate's been slow. Can you take Emma overnight on Wednesdays?" "Of course," I'd said, though I noticed Claire looked surprised when he mentioned the extra shifts. Later, when I asked her about it, she'd seemed confused. "I'm not picking up extra shifts, Mum. My schedule hasn't changed." That was the moment I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed that Daniel's BMW was always impeccably clean, freshly washed. For someone whose real estate business was supposedly struggling, he seemed to have plenty of money for car detailing, expensive dinners, and a new Rolex I'd spotted on his wrist. I noticed that when I tried to look up his real estate listings online, I couldn't find any. No properties with his name, no agency profile, no reviews. Which brokerage do you work with, Daniel? I'd asked casually one evening when he picked up Emma. He'd paused too long. I'm independent, contract work, it's complicated. It wasn't complicated. It was a lie. I just didn't know what kind yet. The real awakening came 6 months before my birthday. Emma had left her stuffed rabbit at my place, and I'd driven over to Claire and Daniel's house in East Vancouver to drop it off. It was Wednesday, late morning. Daniel's car was in the driveway. That was odd. He was supposed to be at a property showing in West Van. I'd knocked. No answer. I'd tried the door. Unlocked. Hello? Daniel? I've got Emma's rabbit. I'd stepped inside. The house was silent. Too silent. I'd walked through to the kitchen. On the table was a laptop, open. The screen had gone dark, but when I'd moved, the mouse just touched it. Barely the screen had lit up. I shouldn't have looked. I know that. It was an invasion of privacy. But something made me look anyway. Bank statements. Dozens of them. But not from any Canadian bank I recognized. Offshore accounts. Numbers with lots of zeros. Transactions moving money in complicated patterns. And a name that kept appearing. Corrigan. James Corrigan. Claire's supposedly gone forever ex-husband. I'd heard footsteps on the stairs. I'd quickly stepped back, but I'd already seen enough. Daniel had appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair wet from a shower, looking startled. Margaret, what are you doing here? Emma's rabbit, I'd said, holding it up. The door was open. I called out. He'd looked at the laptop, then at me. Did you see anything on my computer? Should I have? I'd asked, keeping my voice steady the way I used to with students caught cheating. No, he'd said after a pause. Just work stuff. Confidential client information. I'd left quickly. But I'd already made my decision. I was going to find out what Daniel was hiding, and I was going to find James Corrigan. It took me 3 weeks and $600 I couldn't really afford to spend. I'd hired a private investigator, a retired RCMP officer named Helen, who'd been recommended by another teacher from my school. I need to find someone, I'd told her. And I need to know if my son-in-law is involved in something illegal. Helen had been efficient. Within 2 weeks, she'd found James Corrigan living in Surrey, working as an accountant at a firm downtown. He wasn't dead. He wasn't even hiding. He'd moved on, started over, gotten his gambling problem under control through therapy and Gamblers Anonymous. He'd remarried, had a stepson, seemed to be living a quiet, normal life. Does he know about Daniel? I'd asked Helen. I think you should ask him yourself, she'd said, handing me his address. I'd driven to Surrey on a Wednesday afternoon. James had been surprised to see me at his door. He'd aged more gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but he'd still had the same kind face I remembered from when he and Claire were married. Margaret, he'd said, shocked. Is Claire okay? Is Emma? They're fine, I'd assured him. But I need to talk to you about Daniel. Daniel Merrick. James had gone very still. Then he'd invited me in. What James told me over the next 2 hours made my blood run cold. Daniel Merrick wasn't a real estate agent. He was a scammer. More specifically, he specialized in identity fraud and financial manipulation. He'd targeted James 3 years before he'd even met Claire. They'd met at a casino where James had been struggling with his gambling addiction. Daniel had befriended him, learned about his financial troubles, offered to help. What James hadn't known was that Daniel was systematically copying his identity, his banking information, his credentials. He stole over $40,000 from me, James had said, his voice quiet with shame. He took out credit cards in my name, loans. By the time I realized what was happening, my credit was destroyed. That's part of why Claire and I fell apart. I was so consumed with trying to fix the mess, I couldn't explain what was happening. I was too ashamed. Did you report him to the police? I'd asked. I tried, but Daniel's smart. He covers his tracks, uses shell companies, offshore accounts. The police said without concrete evidence directly linking him, it was hard to prosecute. And I was so deep in my gambling problem, my testimony wasn't exactly reliable. And Claire? Did you know he married Claire? James had looked stricken. Not until a year ago. I saw them together at a mall, with Emma. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to warn Claire, but I had no proof anymore. I'd rebuilt my life. If I'd approached her, it would have looked like jealousy or revenge from a bitter ex-husband. What's he doing with the money he's taking? I'd asked. James had pulled out a folder he'd been keeping tabs, it turned out, hoping to one day have enough evidence. Inside were printouts of property records, business filings, offshore accounts. Daniel had been running the same scam on multiple people, befriending vulnerable men, usually those with addiction issues or financial problems, gaining their trust, then systematically stealing their identities and draining their accounts. He'd stolen from at least 7 other men that James had been able to track. And the money goes offshore? I'd asked. Some. But a lot of it he's been funneling into a property in the Cayman Islands, a resort property he's developing with the stolen funds. If he can get it up and running, he'll have a legitimate business to launder everything through. I'd sat there in James's living room, feeling sick. My daughter had married a criminal. My granddaughter was being raised by a man who made his living destroying people's lives. And I'd been enabling it all by providing free childcare so he could have more time for his schemes. I need your help, I'd said to James. I need to stop him, but I need evidence Claire will believe. That's when James had shown me the rest of his folder. Bank records he'd subpoenaed during his attempt to press charges, emails he'd managed to retrieve, photos of Daniel meeting with his marks, and most damning of all, a recording from a small camera James had set up in his own home the year before everything fell apart, a camera that had caught Daniel going through James's files, photographing credit cards, copying passwords. The police said it wasn't enough because I'd been in and out of casinos. My timeline was unclear, and I couldn't definitively prove he'd used the information, James had explained. But this is enough for Claire to see the truth. If you can get more current evidence, tie him to what he's doing now, maybe we can actually stop him. I'd left Surrey with the folder and a plan. For the next 5 months, I'd watched Daniel carefully. I'd noted his patterns, his schedule. I'd paid attention to when he claimed to be at showings, but his car was somewhere else. I'd befriended one of the women at the car wash he frequented and learned he paid in cash, always. I'd even, and I'm not proud of this, looked through his coat pockets when he left his jacket at my apartment, finding receipt after receipt from expensive restaurants I knew Claire hadn't been to. But the real breakthrough came 3 months before my birthday. Daniel had asked me to watch Emma for an entire weekend. Claire and I are going to Whistler, he'd said. Romantic getaway. But Claire had called me that Friday night from home. Mum, Emma's forgotten Mr. Bunny again. I'm working tomorrow, but can Daniel pick it up before he leaves for Kelowna? Kelowna, not Whistler. I'd said, yes, I'd have the rabbit ready. But when Daniel had arrived Saturday morning, I'd asked casually, all set for Whistler? Yeah, he'd said without hesitation. Should be great weather. He'd lied right to my face. And if he'd lied about where he was going, what else was he doing? I'd called Helen, the private investigator. Can you follow someone for a weekend? I'll pay whatever it costs. Helen had followed Daniel to Kelowna. He'd met with 3 different men, over 2 days. She'd photographed the meetings, recorded conversations from nearby tables, got license plates. When she'd reported back, the pattern was clear. Daniel was in the middle of scamming 2 new victims, both men going through divorces and vulnerable to his friendship and business opportunities. I'd had my evidence. The question was what to do with it. I'd met with James again. We need to tell Claire, I'd said. Together. With everything we have. She'll hate me, James had said quietly. She'll think I'm making it up. Then we need more than just us telling her. We need Daniel to confess. That's when I'd come up with the birthday party plan. It was risky, maybe even cruel, but I needed Daniel to feel cornered, to make a mistake, and I needed Claire to see it happen in real time, surrounded by people, so she couldn't deny it or let him explain it away in private. Planning the party had been the easy part. I'd invited everyone. Claire's nursing colleagues, Daniel's supposed business associates whose names I'd gotten from his phone when he'd left it unattended, neighbors, family. I'd told Claire it was just a small gathering, but I'd made it big enough to matter. Big enough that Daniel would feel the weight of public humiliation if it came to that. I'd also invited James. I'd told him to arrive late, after I'd confronted Daniel. Just be there, I'd said. Claire needs to see you're alive, that you're not the villain Daniel painted you as. The morning of my birthday, I'd felt sick with nerves. Emma had made me a card with crayons, "I love you, Grandma," in her wobbly printing. I'd held her tight, wondering if after today, Daniel would even let me see her anymore. But I'd thought about all those men Daniel had stolen from, all the lives he'd ruined, and I'd thought about my daughter, believing she was married to a good man when she was really married to a predator. I couldn't let it continue. The party had started at 4. People had arrived with wine and flowers and cards. Claire had seemed happy, fussing over the food, making sure I was enjoying myself. Daniel had been his usual charming self, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, playing the perfect son-in-law. At 5:30, I'd stood up to make a toast. That's when Daniel had preempted me. He'd stood up first, glass raised, that confident smile on his face. Before Margaret says anything, I want to say something to her. I'd felt my heart racing. This wasn't part of my plan. Margaret has been an incredible grandmother to Emma, Daniel had said. She's given us countless hours of help, so many days and nights of babysitting, and I don't think we've properly thanked her. He'd pulled out the check with a flourish, $500, made out to me, for all those years of free babysitting. I think that's more than fair. The room had gone silent. I'd seen the horror on Claire's face. Several of her nursing friends had gasped. Even Emma, not fully understanding, had looked confused. I'd realized in that moment what Daniel was doing. He was buying me off, publicly, reducing years of love and family into a transaction he could close with a check, making me feel small, making sure everyone knew he saw me as hired help, not family. But he'd miscalculated, because he'd given me the perfect opening. I'd folded the check slowly, deliberately, then I'd reached into my pocket for the envelope. The room had been so quiet I could hear the paper rustling. "Thank you, Daniel," I'd said, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "But I think you'll want to read this first." I'd watched him open it. I'd watched him read the first page, a summary of the evidence James and I had compiled. The second page, bank records showing offshore accounts in his name. The third page, photographs of him meeting with his current marks in Kelowna. "Where did you get this?" he'd whispered, all the color gone from his face. "I know everything, Daniel. Every single thing." That's when James had walked in. Claire had turned, seen him, and let out a small cry. "James?" "Hello, Claire," James had said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you about him a long time ago." Daniel had looked at James, then at me, then at the door. I'd seen him calculating whether he could run. But Helen, my private investigator friend, was standing by the door. I'd asked her to come, just in case. "You want to explain to everyone here what you really do for a living, Daniel?" I'd asked. "Or should I?" "Mom, what's going on?" Claire had asked, her voice shaking. "Your husband isn't a real estate agent, sweetheart. He's a con artist. He steals identities, drains bank accounts, and ruins lives. He did it to James. He's doing it to at least 3 other men right now. And he's been using our family, using Emma, using me as cover, to look respectable while he destroys people." Daniel had stood there, frozen. For a moment I'd thought he might deny everything. Then he'd looked around the room at 43 faces staring at him with shock and disgust, and something in him had crumbled. "I can explain," he'd said weakly. "Explain to the police," I'd said. "They're outside. I called them 20 minutes ago." That part was a bluff. I hadn't called the police, not yet. I'd wanted to give Claire the choice of whether to press charges or just get Daniel out of her life. But Daniel didn't know that. He'd panicked, bolted for the back door, pushed past Helen. But Helen had been expecting it. She'd been a Mountie for 25 years. Daniel hadn't made it past the building's lobby before she'd had him restrained. The party had dissolved into chaos after that. Claire had been crying, angry, confused. Emma had been scared by all the yelling. Most of the guests had left quickly, uncomfortable with the drama. But a few had stayed, Claire's closest friends, my sister who'd arrived from Toronto that morning, James. Over the next few hours, James and I had explained everything to Claire, shown her all the evidence, answered her questions. She'd been devastated, furious, heartbroken, but underneath it all, I'd seen relief. Because she'd known something was wrong. Maybe she hadn't known what, but she'd felt it. And now, she finally had the truth. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Mum?" she'd asked, tears streaming down her face. "Because I needed to be sure," I'd said. "And I needed enough evidence that you couldn't doubt it. I know how much you loved him. I couldn't come to you with suspicions. I needed proof." Claire had filed for divorce the following week. With James's help and the evidence we'd compiled, she'd also filed a police report. Daniel was arrested 3 days after my birthday party. Turns out, there were warrants for him in 2 other provinces under different names. The police had been looking for him for years. The trial took 8 months. Daniel pleaded guilty to fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims, though everyone knew that money was long gone, hidden in accounts we'd probably never find. Claire had struggled in the aftermath. Therapy helped, so did time. And surprisingly, so did James. They didn't get back together, too much had happened, too many years had passed, but they became friends again, co-parents. Even though Emma wasn't James's biological daughter, James had always loved Emma, and Emma adored him. When Claire told her that James was an old friend who would be around more often, Emma had been thrilled. As for me, I got my granddaughter time back. But it was different now, better. Claire and I would have coffee while Emma played, and we'd actually talk, really talk, about the warning signs we'd missed, about trusting our instincts, about the difference between being kind and being taken advantage of. "You saved us, Mum," Claire had said to me one afternoon about a year after everything happened. We were at the park, watching Emma on the swings. "I loved you," I'd said simply. "That's what you do when you love someone. You protect them, even when it's hard, even when you're scared." The check Daniel had given me $500 for years of love. I'd never cashed it. I'd framed it instead. It hangs in my kitchen now, a reminder, not of the insult, but of the moment I'd chosen to fight back. The moment I'd decided that my daughter and granddaughter were worth more than staying quiet, worth more than keeping the peace, worth more than my own fear of confrontation. I turned 61 last month. We had a small party, just Claire, Emma, my sister, and a few close friends. No drama, no revelations, just cake and laughter, and Emma singing happy birthday off-key while wearing a paper crown. At one point, Emma had climbed into my lap with sticky icing fingers and said, "Grandma, you're my favorite person in the whole world." I'd held her close, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo, and thought about that check on my kitchen wall. $500. Daniel had thought that's what I was worth. But sitting there with my granddaughter in my arms, my daughter smiling nearby, I knew exactly what I was worth. Everything.